He stopped in Harlow, Minnesota because Scout stopped. That was how most of their decisions got made. Caleb drove. Scout watched. And when the dog indicated that something in a particular place required attention, Caleb paid attention. 20 years in Army Special Forces had a way of teaching a man that the instincts of a trained animal were worth more than most human opinions. They had been traveling for 8 months. No destination. No schedule. Caleb drove and Scout pointed and they stopped where the stopping seemed right. Harlow was a town of 1,100 people on the flat agricultural plain of southern Minnesota. 3 grain elevators, a diner, a hardware store, a church, a county sheriff's office. The kind of place where people knew each other's business and where that knowledge was mostly used well. Mostly. Scout found what was in the field on the second morning. Caleb had let him out early to work the pasture at the edge of the county road where they had camped, and the dog had moved in his systematic way across the harvested corn field and stopped at a point 200 yards from the road and sat down and looked back at Caleb with those pale amber eyes. Caleb walked out to him. He did not know what Scout had found. He did not know that the thing buried in that field connected to a name that an entire county had been told not to speak for 11 years. He did not know that the man who had ensured that silence was the same man who wore the county sheriff's badge. He only knew that Scout did not sit like that without a reason. And that whatever was under that ground was about to come up. Caleb Marsh had served 20 years in the United States Army as a Special Forces weapons sergeant and later as a team sergeant in the 5th Special Forces Group. He had done the work that Special Forces does, the work that does not appear in press releases or public records, that takes men into countries whose governments have not invited them, to accomplish objectives that cannot be listed in a service record with any specificity. He was 56 years old. Broad-shouldered and solid in the way of men who have kept themselves capable out of habit rather than vanity. His gray hair was kept short. His jaw was square and usually carried several days of silver stubble. His green eyes had the specific quality of a man who had learned to assess threats so efficiently that the skill had become invisible. He looked unhurried because he had already completed the calculation that most men were still beginning. He had left the army 18 months ago. Not by choice, or not entirely. There had been a medical review. Something in the left knee that had finally collected enough years and enough descents from enough helicopters to require a conversation. They had offered him a desk. He had declined the desk and accepted the discharge. He had sold his apartment in Clarksville, Tennessee, packed his truck with what mattered, which was not very much, and departed with Scout in the passenger seat and no map that he was paying attention to. Scout had been with him for 6 years. The dog had been a military working dog trained for patrol and detection at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, retired early due to an injury that had healed well enough for everything except high-velocity work. Caleb had adopted him through the military working dog placement program because he trusted what he had seen Scout do in the field, and because the dog had looked at him during the placement interview with those unusual pale amber eyes and Caleb had understood immediately that the look meant they were already decided. They had been on the road for 8 months when they reached Harlow. Caleb worked day labor when money required it, roofing in Missouri, grain elevator maintenance in Iowa, fence repair in Illinois. He was capable with his hands in the way that Special Forces men often were, and he asked for nothing beyond fair pay and a place to park his truck for the night. He had learned to sleep without difficulty wherever Scout settled. If the dog was calm, Caleb was calm. If Scout was alert, Caleb's eyes were open before the thought had formed. They had camped on the county road south of Harlow because the sun was going and the next town was 40 miles and Caleb had no particular reason to drive 40 miles in the dark. Dorothy Oakes had come to the truck window that evening. She was a black woman in her late 60s who lived in the third house from the county road and who, she explained with no preamble, had been watching travelers pull off on that shoulder for 30 years and generally brought them coffee because the nearest motel was indeed 40 miles and she had always found it useful to know who was in the county. Caleb had accepted the coffee. Scout had examined Dorothy with his nose and then sat beside her boot in a way that was neither submissive nor demanding but was clearly positive. Dorothy had looked down at the dog and then at Caleb and said, "He makes up his mind fast." Caleb said the dog was usually right. Dorothy said she hoped so, because she had something she had wanted to tell someone for 11 years and she had been waiting for the right someone to come down that road. She said she would come back in the morning if that was all right. Caleb said it was. He sat on the tailgate with Scout and watched the flat Minnesota sky go dark above the fields and thought about what a woman who painted signs for 40 years was carrying that required 11 years of waiting for the right stranger. Dorothy came back at sunrise with a thermos of coffee and a manila folder that had been kept inside a plastic bag inside a tin box inside a cedar chest in her bedroom since 2015. She sat in the passenger seat of Caleb's truck and she told him about James Okafor. James had been 29 years old. He had grown up in Harlow and left for college in St. Paul and come back at 26 to take over his father's small farm on the south edge of town. He had been a good farmer and a good neighbor, and he had been black in a county where being black was not common and where the sheriff, Burrell Hicks, had made his feelings about that fact known over many years through the specific accumulation of small official actions, stops, citations, inspections, that never crossed a line that could be formally challenged but that added up, as these things add up, into something that everyone in the county understood. In November of 2015, James Okafor had disappeared. His truck was found on the county road 2 miles south of Harlow. His dog, a mixed breed named Charlie, had been found the following day in the north field of his farm, dehydrated but alive. The investigation had been conducted by the county sheriff's office. Sheriff Hicks had concluded within 3 weeks that James Okafor had likely left the county voluntarily, citing personal difficulties. He noted that James had not been in contact with his family but suggested this was consistent with the circumstances. James's mother, Adiz Okafor, had told Dorothy at the time that James would not leave his dog. That the dog being found alone on the farm was the only thing that told her what she already knew but could not prove. The investigation had been closed. Dorothy had not accepted this. She had spent 11 years collecting what she could without the authority to compel anyone to give her anything. She had records of the official investigation file, obtained through a public records request, and she had her own notes, and she had a photograph that a highway camera 12 miles from Harlow had captured on the night James disappeared. She had obtained the photograph through a contact at the State Transportation Department. The photograph showed the rear of a county sheriff's vehicle on Highway 14, heading away from Harlow at 11:47 p.m. on the night of November 14, 2015. The county sheriff's log for that night showed no patrol activity on Highway 14. Dorothy had not known what to do with this for 11 years. She had no law enforcement connections. She had no lawyer. She had no money for a lawyer. She had a folder and a photograph and a certainty that could not be shaken. She handed the folder to Caleb. He read it the way he read everything, methodically, completely, without a visible reaction. When he finished he looked at the flat harvested field to the south and was quiet for a moment. He asked her 3 questions. She answered each one precisely. He said, "All right." He said he was going to let Scout walk the field. Dorothy looked at the dog in the back seat. Scout was already watching the field. Caleb opened the door and Scout dropped to the ground without being told and moved toward the south field at his working pace, nose beginning its sweep before his feet had settled into the soil. Dorothy stood at the truck and watched the gray and silver dog move across the flat Minnesota ground in the early morning light. She had waited 11 years. She could wait another hour. Scout worked the field for 40 minutes. He moved in the systematic overlapping arcs that his training had built into him over years, not random searching, not excitement, but the methodical coverage of ground that his handlers had always trusted. He did not hurry. He did not distract. His pale amber eyes moved between the ground and the middle distance the way a navigator watches a chart and a horizon simultaneously. He stopped at a point 200 yards south of the county road and sat down. He looked back at Caleb. Then at the ground. Then at Caleb. Caleb walked to him. He crouched beside the dog and looked at the ground. The soil in this section of the harvested field was different in a way that was visible if you knew how to read ground, a slightly different color from the surrounding soil, a barely perceptible depression in the uniformity of the harvested corn rows. Old disturbance. Long healed over by seasons but still there. He looked at Scout. Scout looked at him with those pale amber eyes and did not move from the spot. Caleb stood up and pulled out his phone. He photographed the location from multiple angles. He pulled up a satellite mapping application and dropped a precise pin. He photographed Scout sitting at the location. He photographed the surrounding field to establish context. He did this without touching the ground and without disturbing anything. He walked back to the truck. Dorothy was standing at the tailgate with her coffee thermos, watching him. He told her what Scout had found. He showed her the photographs. He told her that he could not determine what was below the ground without equipment he did not have, but that Scout's indication in this kind of location, open ground, old disturbance, the specific detection behavior the dog used for this category of search, was something he took seriously. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. She said, "I need you to understand something." The last person who tried to ask questions about James was the county reporter from the Harlow Courier. She published one article with some of what I gave her. 2 weeks later her press plates were vandalized. She left town 6 months after that. The story died when she left. Caleb said he understood. Dorothy said, "Burrell Hicks has been sheriff of this county for 30 years. He is on a first-name basis with the county attorney, the county commissioner, and the owner of the only local paper. His deputy has been with him for 20 years. The State Bureau of Criminal Apprehension has received 2 formal complaints about the James Okafor investigation. Both were reviewed and found insufficient for intervention." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He said, "Who filed the complaints?" Dorothy said she had filed the first one. James's mother had filed the second, before she died in 2019. He asked if she had contacted the FBI. She said she had written twice. She had received standard acknowledgement letters. Caleb looked at the field where Scout was still sitting at the location, patient and precise, waiting. He said, "The FBI has a civil rights cold case unit. Letters go to a general queue. A submission with specific physical evidence, documented location, detection indication from a certified working dog, photographic record, goes to a different part of the queue." Dorothy looked at him. He said, "I know someone in Minneapolis. Former Army. She works for the Bureau now. She will return my call." Dorothy said, "Why would you do this? You have no stake in Harlow." Caleb thought about this for a moment. He looked at Scout sitting in the middle of a flat Minnesota field, still and certain, waiting for him to understand what needed to be done. He said, "Scout found it. That's enough of a reason." He called his contact in Minneapolis that afternoon from the county road where the cell signal was sufficient. He had served with Sarah Chen for 2 years at Fort Bragg before she had left the Army and entered the FBI through the Veterans Hiring Program. She was now a special agent in the Minneapolis field office. She answered on the 3rd ring. He told her what Scout had found. He told her about Dorothy's folder. He told her about the satellite photograph and the patrol log discrepancy. Sarah was quiet for longer than comfortable. Then she said, "Send me everything. Tonight." He sent it that night from the parking lot of the Harlow Public Library, which had the best Wi-Fi signal in town. The following morning, Sheriff Burrell Hicks drove past the county road campsite in his cruiser and slowed. Caleb was sitting on the tailgate with coffee. Scout was in the truck. Hicks stopped. He got out. He was a heavy-set man in a well-pressed uniform with the specific ease of someone who had owned a room for 30 years. He said he understood Caleb had been asking around about some old matters. Caleb said he had not been asking around about anything. Hicks said word traveled in small towns. Caleb said it did. Hicks said the south field was private property and camping on the county road was technically a matter he could enforce at his discretion. Caleb said he appreciated the information. Hicks looked at the truck. Scout was visible through the window, watching Hicks with pale amber eyes. Hicks said, "That's an interesting-looking dog." Caleb said, "He is." Hicks waited for more. Nothing came. He got back in his cruiser and drove. Scout watched the cruiser until it was gone. Caleb went inside the truck, closed the door, and called Sarah Chen. He said, "Move faster if you can." She said she already was. 4 days later, 2 FBI vehicles arrived in Harlow from Minneapolis. They did not stop at the sheriff's office. They went directly to the county courthouse with federal warrants and to the south field with a forensic team and ground-penetrating radar equipment. Caleb had moved to Dorothy's driveway by then, with her permission. He watched the forensic team work the field from a distance with Scout beside him. Dorothy stood at the fence line near the house, her hands folded, her eyes on the field. She had waited 11 years. What the forensic team found in the field required 2 additional days of work before the FBI was prepared to make any public statement. During those 2 days, Sheriff Burrell Hicks twice attempted to make contact with the federal team through official channels. He was directed on both occasions to the FBI's Public Affairs Office. On the 3rd day, the FBI Public Affairs Office issued a brief statement. An investigation was ongoing. A discovery had been made consistent with the information provided. No further details would be released pending notification of family. There was no family to notify. James Okafor's mother had died in 2019. His father had died in 2013. He had been an only child. Dorothy was the closest thing to family that remained. The FBI agent who came to Dorothy's door was Sarah Chin. She was a compact woman in her early 40s with a direct manner that Caleb recognized from having served with her. She shook Dorothy's hand and told her what had been found and what the preliminary findings indicated. Dorothy listened without looking away. When Sarah had finished, Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "His dog came home. Did you know that?" When they found the truck, Charlie walked home across 2 miles of field. They found him at the farm the next morning. Sarah said she had read the original file. Dorothy said, "A dog doesn't leave. Not on his own. Someone put Charlie out on that farm." Sarah said she understood. Sheriff Burrell Hicks was placed under federal arrest on a Thursday morning, 11 years and 3 weeks after James Okafor disappeared. His deputy, who had filed the fraudulent patrol log, was arrested 2 hours later. Caleb was not in Harlow when it happened. He had moved on 2 days before, it was not his place to be there for that part, and he understood the difference between the work that required his presence and the work that did not. He had stopped at a rest area 60 miles north when Dorothy called him. She said, "It happened." He said, "Good." There was a pause. Dorothy said, "I've been carrying that folder for 11 years. I showed it to 7 different people before you. None of them knew what to do with it. How did you know what to do with it?" Caleb thought about how to answer that. He watched Scout in the rest area grass, moving in the methodical arcs that were simply how he existed in the world, covering ground, looking for what was there. He said, "I followed the dog." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Caleb." He said it was Scout she should thank. She said she knew. Caleb drove north for 4 days after Harlow. He did not listen to the news coverage. He did not need to know the details of what came after. He had learned in 2 decades of work that the moment of action and the long administrative consequence of the moment were separate things, and that a man could participate in one without needing to witness the other. He stopped at a state campground in northern Minnesota, on the shore of a lake whose name he could not easily pronounce, and made a fire and sat beside it with Scout pressed against his leg. The lake was flat and gray and very large. The trees on the far shore were bare birch and aspen. The sky above was the specific pale winter white of Minnesota in November. It was very quiet. Caleb was not a man who spent time examining his own decisions. He made them, he executed them, he moved. But he found himself sitting by the lake fire thinking about Dorothy carrying that folder for 11 years. About the patience required for that. About the specific courage of a woman who had no official standing and no institutional support and who had kept a plastic bag inside a tin box inside a cedar chest because she believed that one day the right person would come down that county road. He thought about James Okafor's dog walking home across 2 miles of field. He thought about Scout sitting in the middle of a flat corn field and looking back at him with those pale amber eyes. Scout was lying with his chin on Caleb's boot, looking at the fire. Caleb rested his hand on the dog's back. He said, "Good work." Scout's tail moved once. 3 weeks later, Dorothy sent him a message through the contact information he had left. It was a photograph. She had painted a mural on the side of the Harlow grain elevator, the largest flat surface in town. It was a portrait of a young man standing in a field, looking toward the horizon. It was beautiful. It was clearly James. Below the portrait, in the careful lettering of a woman who had spent 40 years painting words, she had written. He was here. He mattered. He is remembered. Caleb looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he started the truck. Scout climbed into the passenger seat and looked at him with pale amber eyes. Caleb said, "All right." He drove north. The road was long and flat and the sky above it was the specific pale white of Minnesota in November, and somewhere ahead of them there was another county road and another field and another reason that the dog would tell him about when they arrived. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. Caleb and Scout remind us of something important. Justice does not always arrive on schedule. Sometimes it requires a woman who will wait 11 years with a plastic bag inside a tin box inside a cedar chest. Sometimes it requires a stranger with no stake in a place to stop on a county road because his dog stopped. Dorothy knew what had happened. She had always known. What she needed was someone with the specific skills to translate that knowledge into something that could not be set aside. Scout found what was in that field because that is what Scout does. He covers ground, he pays attention, and he communicates what he finds to the person beside him. He has been doing this his entire life. He does not decide when to use this skill and when to withhold it. He simply does it, in every field, in every county, in every place where Caleb stops the truck and opens the door. That is the most faithful kind of loyalty. The kind that does not wait to decide whether the moment is worth it. If Caleb and Scout's story stayed with you today, drop an amen in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the truth does not disappear, it waits. Subscribe, because we have more stories like this one every week. God bless you. And God bless the ones who cover the ground.